Lucille O'Neal walked into Tate's bakery for a simple cup of coffee. What happened next shook an entire town. A quiet act of discrimination. A moment caught on camera. A business on the brink of collapse. But when Big Shaq steps in, not as a celebrity, but as a son, the man behind the counter learns the hard way that silence won't save him. Because this isn't just about one morning at a bakery. This is about power, justice, and a reckoning that no one saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The golden sun bathed the town in a soft morning glow. It was the kind of day that made people linger just a little longer over their coffee, savoring the crisp air before the world demanded their attention. The smell of freshly baked bread drifted from Tate's bakery, wrapping around the quiet street like an invitation. Lucille O'Neal, graceful and composed, stepped out of her sleek black SUV, adjusting her sunglasses as she took in the familiar storefront. She had been coming here for months, a habit formed out of nostalgia rather than necessity. The pastries were good, but the bakery itself had the kind of charm that reminded her of the small-town warmth she grew up with. Inside, the place buzzed with the comforting hum of morning conversations. A young woman at the front counter giggled as she handed over a neatly packaged croissant to a man in a tailored suit. The smell of cinnamon and coffee filled the space, and behind the glass display, golden brown pastries gleamed under the warm light. Lucille took her place in line, her presence unassuming yet dignified. She smoothed out the sleeves of her elegant beige coat, waiting patiently as the line moved forward. When it was her turn, she stepped up to the counter with a gentle smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm. "I'll have my usual, please." The cashier, a young woman with deep auburn hair tied in a messy ponytail, barely glanced up. Silence. Lucille hesitated. Perhaps the girl hadn't heard her. "I'll have the almond croissant and a coffee, black." The cashier's fingers drummed idly against the register, her expression unreadable. Her eyes flickered past Lucille as if she were an afterthought. "Hold on." The words came out flat, clipped. Lucille blinked. Hold on? The request wasn't complicated. Just then, the door chimed, and a couple strolled in. A middle-aged man in a sharp blazer, his wife dressed in pastel silk. The cashier's demeanor shifted instantly. Her face brightened, and she leaned forward with a practiced warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway. The usual?" she chirped. Lucille turned slightly, watching as the couple were greeted with the kind of hospitality she had expected for herself. The cashier quickly rang up their order, smiling, chatting, moving with a sense of urgency that had been noticeably absent moments before. Lucille exhaled slowly, pressing her lips together. She had been here enough times to recognize what was happening. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was intentional. She wasn't invisible. She was being ignored. The moment stretched, the weight of it settling into her bones. Her fingers curled lightly against the counter, but she forced herself to remain composed. When the Calloways stepped aside, bags in hand, Lucille spoke again. Clearer. Firmer. "I believe I was next." The cashier finally looked at her. Truly looked at her. But her expression was blank. Unimpressed. She sighed through her nose and tapped at the register lazily. What was it again? Lucille felt a sharp pang in her chest, not just from the delay but from the disrespect woven so neatly into the girl's indifference. She had dealt with this kind of treatment before. Small, cutting gestures that weren't loud enough to be outright hostile, but sharp enough to remind her she wasn't welcome. It was the kind of racism that lived in places like this, wrapped in politeness, disguised as mere oversight. Still, she refused to let it rattle her. "An almond croissant and a black coffee." Her voice remained steady. The girl nodded slowly, dragging out the process. She reached for a tray, but her movements were sluggish, deliberately unhurried. It was a small act of defiance, but it spoke volumes. Lucille felt her patience begin to fray. Just then, another voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem?" Lucille turned to see a man standing just beyond the counter, Jonathan Tate, the owner. Tate had the posture of a man who had spent years in the same place, watching his business thrive under his watchful eye. He wasn't old, but he carried himself with the weight of someone who had long stopped questioning his authority. Lucille met his gaze evenly. "No problem at all, just waiting on my order." Tate's eyes flicked between her and the cashier. Then, without asking for an explanation, he spoke. "We're a little busy today. If you're in a rush, maybe, you should try somewhere else." The words landed heavy in the space between them. Lucille's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, like her presence was a burden, like she had made a mistake by walking through his doors. The air in the bakery shifted. A few customers paused their conversations, stealing glances, sensing the quiet tension rising in the room. Lucille could have walked away. She could have taken the insult, swallowed it like she had been taught to do in moments like this. But she wasn't that woman anymore. Slowly, she straightened her shoulders. "Excuse me?" Tate's expression remained unmoved. "You heard me." Lucille let the silence sit between them for a moment longer, studying the man before her. She wasn't angry. Anger was easy. This was something deeper. A quiet, settled kind of disappointment that had been earned over years of watching people like Tate get away with treating people like her as less than. She inhaled sharply, exhaled, then reached into her purse. She pulled out a crisp $20 bill and set it on the counter with deliberate care. "Keep the change." Then, without waiting for the order that would never come, she turned and walked out of the bakery, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence that clung to the walls like smoke. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the morning air no longer felt fresh. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. She had expected a normal morning, a simple moment of routine and familiarity. Instead, she had walked straight into a reminder that even here, even now, some things hadn't changed. And as she slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel a little tighter than before, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Lucille O'Neal wasn't a woman who made a scene. She was raised to carry herself with dignity, to pick her battles, and to walk away from ignorance rather than feed into it. But there was something about this moment, the dismissiveness, the sheer audacity of it, that settled in her chest like a burning coal. She stood firm in front of the counter, her back straight, her expression measured. The bakery's warm scent of cinnamon and coffee had lost its comfort. The hum of quiet conversation around her felt distant now, like static in the background of a moment that had suddenly become far too sharp. The cashier, still uninterested, reached lazily for the $20 bill Lucille had placed on the counter. But before she could slide it into the register, Lucille spoke again, her voice steady, yet cutting through the air like glass. "I'd like to understand something." The cashier hesitated, her fingers still on the bill, but she didn't look up. A few customers in the bakery turned their heads slightly, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "Was there a reason I was ignored?" Lucille asked, her voice calm but unwavering. "Or is that just how you do business?" Finally, the cashier lifted her gaze. She looked young, early 20s maybe, but her eyes carried something colder than just inexperience. Indifference. The kind of practiced carelessness that people used when they knew they could get away with it. "I told you we're busy," the girl muttered, as if the excuse were enough. Lucille let the silence stretch between them, not looking away, not letting it slide. "Too busy for me?" The words weren't loud, but they were deliberate, and they hit harder than if she had raised her voice. The customers in the shop were no longer pretending not to listen. A few had stopped mid-sip, their cups hovering near their lips. Others shifted awkwardly, eyes darting between Lucille and the girl at the register. Some seemed uncomfortable, some amused, and a few carried expressions that made Lucille's skin prickle. People who silently approved, who thought this was exactly how things should be. The tension cracked further when a door behind the counter swung open. Jonathan Tate stepped out. His presence wasn't imposing, but it carried weight. He was a man in his late 50s, dressed in a simple button-down, sleeves rolled up, apron still tied around his waist. He had the kind of face that had weathered years of business, the kind of posture that told you he had built this place with his own hands. And with that posture came something else, entitlement. His eyes flicked between his employee and Lucille, and in an instant, a quiet understanding passed between him and the girl. It was unspoken, but clear. She didn't need to explain. He already knew, and he already had an answer ready. "Ma'am?" Tate said, exhaling like he had just been interrupted from something important. "Is there a problem?" Lucille met his gaze, refusing to let him intimidate her. "I believe I was skipped in line, twice." Tate let out a slow, drawn-out sigh, the kind people used when they wanted you to feel like you were being difficult. He turned his attention to the cashier. "You skipped her?" he asked, though there was no real concern in his voice. The girl shrugged, a ghost of a smirk on her lips. She was taking too long to order. A sharp, incredulous laugh escaped Lucille before she could stop it. "Too long?" she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "I ordered in less than 5 seconds, and I was ignored." Tate's lips pressed into a thin line. His patience was clearly wearing thin. "Look," he said, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "We've got a lot of customers to serve. If you don't like the service, you're free to take your business elsewhere." Lucille's jaw tightened. There it was. The dismissal. The quiet way certain people told you didn't belong. She wasn't expecting an apology. But this was arrogance. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Someone in the crowd, a young man near the back, was holding up his phone, recording. For the first time, the weight of the moment fully settled over her. This wasn't just about a bad morning at a bakery. This wasn't just about her. She could see the lines being drawn, people who wanted to pretend nothing was happening, people who knew exactly what was happening but wouldn't speak up, and people who wanted this to happen. She took a slow breath. She wouldn't let herself be the angry black woman they wanted her to be. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, she gave Tate a long, steady look, then turned to the cashier. "What's your name?" The girl blinked, suddenly thrown off. "What?" "Your name," Lucille repeated. "You work in customer service. Don't you think your customers should know who they're speaking to?" The girl's smirk faltered slightly. She looked to Tate, who folded his arms and leaned against the counter, clearly done with the conversation. "You don't need to know her name," he said coolly. "Like I said, if you don't like it here, you can go somewhere else." Lucille exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I see." She turned then, taking her time, letting the silence stretch as she walked toward the exit. She could feel the stares on her back, the quiet judgment, the tension still thick in the air. The door chimed as she stepped out, the cold air rushing to meet her. She wasn't humiliated. She had refused to let them see her crumble. But there was something about walking away, something about knowing they thought they had won, that burned. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her keys. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again. She pulled it out, ready to ignore whatever message had come through, until she saw the notification, a video link, a caption. "You need to see this." Frowning, she clicked on it. And there it was, the confrontation, captured from start to finish. It was already spreading. Fast. The comments were angry, furious. She stared at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. And then, for the first time since she had stepped into that bakery, a slow, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. This wasn't over. Not even close. The bakery's warm glow had long since faded, replaced by the cold light of phone screens. The video had taken on a life of its own, spreading through social media like wildfire. By the time the town had settled into sleep, the internet was wide awake. The footage was clear. Lucille O'Neal standing tall, her voice steady but firm. The clipped, dismissive tone of the cashier. The indifference in Jonathan Tate's posture. The words that hung in the air like a slap. "If you don't like the service, you're free to take your business elsewhere." It was more than just another viral clip. It was a symbol. A moment that reflected a much larger, uglier truth. Comments flooded in. Anger, disgust, support, and of course denial. This is exactly why we still have a problem. Disgusting. Boycott Tate's bakery. You're all overreacting. She wasn't treated badly. Some people just love playing the victim. The battle lines were drawn, the debate raging across platforms, news outlets picking up the story before sunrise. By morning, Tate's bakery was the center of a storm it never saw coming. Shaquille O'Neal had woken up early that day, his schedule packed. A charity event, a few interviews, then a meeting with a foundation he was backing. His mornings were usually calm, his routine steady. Not today. His phone was buzzing relentlessly. Missed calls, texts, Twitter notifications climbing into the thousands. He frowned, picking up his phone, scanning the messages. Most were variations of the same thing. "You seen this yet? Yo, what's going on with your mom? You need to check this out, man." Still half asleep, he clicked the link. And just like that, Shaq's entire morning changed. The video played out in crisp detail. He saw his mother, calm but unmistakably firm. He saw the shift in the room, the tension, the ugly entitlement on Tate's face. He heard the words, felt the disrespect. By the time the clip ended, Shaq was sitting up, fully awake, his jaw tight. His mother had texted him too. A short, almost dismissive message. "It's nothing. Don't worry about it." But it wasn't nothing. Shaq had spent his entire life protecting the people he loved. On the court, off the court, his family always came first. And if there was one thing he knew about his mother, it was that she never wanted to be a burden. But this wasn't something to ignore. He took a slow breath, rolling his shoulders, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't just angry. He was disappointed. Not surprised, because he had seen this kind of thing happen his whole life. But disappointed, because people still thought they could get away with it. He tapped his phone screen, scrolling through his contacts, then pressed call. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "What's up, big man?" Shaq's voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. "We need to talk." And just like that, things were set into motion. This wasn't going to be another viral moment lost in the noise. This was personal, and it wasn't over. The morning air was crisp, but inside Tate's bakery, the atmosphere was anything but light. There was a weight in the air, an unspoken tension clinging to the walls like humidity before a storm. The news had spread far beyond this small town. Overnight, protests had begun to brew online, customers had canceled orders, and bad press had started creeping into local headlines. The bakery, once a staple of the community, now carried a stain that wouldn't wash out easily. But none of that mattered in this moment. Not to the staff, not to the customers lingering inside. Because right now, Lucille O'Neal was standing in the doorway. The moment he stepped inside, the air changed. The usual chatter cut short. The clinking of coffee cups stilled. The cashier, the same girl who had treated his mother like an afterthought, froze behind the register. She was still holding a half-filled cup, the coffee swirling inside as her hands trembled slightly. And then there was Jonathan Tate. He stood behind the counter, his stance forced casual, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. A bead of sweat traced the side of his face, despite the cool morning air filtering in from the door Shaq had left open behind him. Tate had built this bakery from the ground up. He had seen all kinds of customers walk through that door, had handled tough business situations, had even weathered the occasional bad review. But nothing had ever prepared him for this. Shaq didn't move right away. He let the silence stretch, his towering presence alone saying more than words ever could. No yelling, no threats. Just a quiet, unshakable weight. He took a slow step forward, every movement deliberate, controlled. Then, in a voice calm but carrying the weight of an earthquake, he spoke. "What exactly did my mother do to deserve that treatment?" Tate cleared his throat, forcing a smirk as if he wasn't feeling the heat pressing down on him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though the slight waver in his voice betrayed him. Shaq let the words hang for a moment. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. "You do." That was all he said. And somehow, it was worse than if he had yelled. The customers were still frozen in place, their eyes darting between the two men, caught between morbid curiosity and secondhand discomfort. Tate exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like this was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Look, man," he started, forcing a chuckle. "I don't know what the internet is telling you, but I run a fair business here. No one gets special treatment. No one gets mistreated either. We were busy, your mother was impatient, and people..." Shaq took another step forward. Tate immediately stopped talking. Shaq didn't raise his voice, didn't interrupt, didn't let anger twist his features. Instead, he simply looked at him, and suddenly, Tate seemed to shrink. Shaq had spent years handling egos, in locker rooms, in business meetings, on the court. He had seen every type of arrogance, and he knew exactly how to break it. "I watched the video," Shaq said, his voice steady. "The whole world did." Tate's smirk faltered. Shaq didn't stop, didn't let him escape the moment. "I saw how my mother was ignored. I saw how she was dismissed. And I saw how, when she challenged it, you doubled down. You didn't apologize. You didn't fix it. You made sure she knew she wasn't welcome." Tate scoffed, arms folding across his chest. "Oh, come on, this is ridiculous. People get bad service all the time. It had nothing to do with her race." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Say that again." His voice was softer this time, but somehow it hit harder. Tate faltered. Shaq let a slow breath pass through his nose. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said. "People like you think you get to decide when racism is real. You think just because no one used a slur, it didn't happen. You think as long as you don't say the words out loud, we're all supposed to pretend we don't see it." Tate opened his mouth, but Shaq wasn't done. "Tell me something." Shaq leaned forward slightly. "If that had been a white woman, dressed like my mother, carrying herself the way she did, do you honestly think she would have been ignored? Do you really believe she would have been told to take her business elsewhere?" Tate's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The words weren't coming as easily anymore. Shaq held his gaze, waiting for an answer Tate wasn't brave enough to give. The silence that followed was loud. The other customers weren't pretending anymore. Some were nodding subtly, others shifting uncomfortably. The cashier behind the counter looked like she wanted to disappear. Finally, Tate scoffed again. But this time there was no confidence behind it. "I don't have to justify myself to you." His voice was quieter now. Shaq exhaled, his jaw tightening for just a second. Then he straightened to his full height. And for the first time since stepping into the bakery, he smiled. Not a kind smile. Not a warm one. A knowing one. Because now, everyone had seen it. The hesitation. The avoidance. Tate had just proven everything Shaq had come here to expose. Shaq nodded once, slow and deliberate. "That's what I thought." And with that, he turned and walked away. The moment his back was turned, the silence in the bakery cracked. The tension that had been building, tightening, pressing down, finally broke. Customers whispered. Some glared at Tate. Others took their coffee and left, shaking their heads. A few pulled out their phones, already typing. Tate was left standing there, his business crumbling in real time. And as Shaq stepped outside, he could feel the shift. This wasn't just a viral moment anymore. This was a reckoning. And it was far from over. The moment Shaq turned to leave, the room cracked open. The bakery, which had been thick with silence, suddenly erupted into noise. Customers who had been frozen just moments ago began talking. No, arguing. "You see what just happened? That was disgusting." "Oh, come on. This is being blown way out of proportion." "No, man, you saw it. We all saw it. He couldn't even answer the damn question." Shaq paused near the door, not turning back, but listening. It was always the same pattern. Some people saw the truth immediately. They felt it, recognized it, called it out. Others, the ones who didn't want to admit what they had just witnessed, started grasping for excuses. And then, there were the ones who didn't care at all. "This is ridiculous," a man in a baseball cap muttered, shaking his head. No one was rude to his mom. Now this guy's trying to cancel a small business over nothing. A woman scoffed, loud enough to be heard. "You ever been ignored at a counter before? No? Then maybe sit this one out." Tate, still behind the counter, watched the argument unfold, his fingers curling into a fist on the countertop. He wasn't looking at the customers. He was looking at Shaq. He was losing control of his bakery, of the moment, of the narrative. And that, more than anything, made him snap. "You think because you're famous, you can walk in here and act like you own the place?" The bakery fell silent again. The words hit the air like a slap. Shaq turned back slowly. His face was calm, but his eyes, His eyes carried something sharp, something piercing. Tate didn't back down. If anything, his chest puffed up. He wasn't going to be humiliated in his own shop. Not by some basketball star who thought he could waltz in and dictate how things worked. "You people," Tate started, shaking his head. Shaq lifted a hand. "Careful." Tate stopped. He swallowed. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but he had meant it. And everyone in the room knew it. Shaq let the silence stretch before speaking, his voice low and measured. "This isn't about fame." His tone was even, but there was an edge to it now. "This isn't even just about race." Tate frowned. Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying him, seeing him clearly. And then, it clicked. This wasn't just about racism. It was about power. Tate didn't hate black people. He hated successful black people. He hated the ones who didn't stay in their place. The ones who walked into his bakery without needing him. The ones he couldn't look down on. Because Shaq wasn't just some guy Tate could dismiss. Shaq was bigger than him, more powerful, more respected, more influential. And that, more than anything, burned. Tate had built this bakery from nothing. He was supposed to be the man in control here. But in the span of a single morning, Shaquille O'Neal had stepped inside and reminded everyone in this town that power was shifting. And that scared Tate more than anything. Shaq nodded slowly. "I get it now." Tate flinched slightly but tried to hide it. "Get what?" Shaq exhaled. "This was never about my mother. Not really." He gestured around the bakery, taking in the argument still brewing between customers, the quiet cashier who still hadn't spoken since. He walked in, the way Tate was holding himself like a man who had already lost but refused to accept it. "You didn't ignore her because you're openly racist. That would have been too easy." Tate bristled. "Watch yourself." Shaq chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "No, see, you ignored her because you're used to being the one in charge. You're used to deciding who matters and who doesn't." Tate stiffened. Shaq took a step closer. "You hate people like me, not because of the color of my skin, but because no matter how much money you make, how many people in this town like you, how much control you think you have." He leaned in slightly. "You will never be bigger than me." The words landed like a brick to the chest. Tate's face flushed red, his lips pressed into a thin, white line. He had nothing to say. Because Shaq was right, and he knew it. Shaq let the silence stretch for a few more seconds, then took a slow step back, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the last bit of weight from the conversation. "You messed with the wrong woman." With that, he turned toward the door, ready to leave for good. But before he could step out, someone in the crowd spoke up. "What happens now?" It was the woman who had defended Lucille earlier. Shaq paused, looking over his shoulder. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the question sit there. What happens now? It wasn't up to him. It was up to them, the town, the customers, the people who had spent years eating at this bakery, acting like things like this didn't happen. Would they still come here? Would they still support Tate? Would they pretend this morning never happened? Or would they finally see the truth? Shaq met the woman's gaze, then looked around the room, scanning the faces, taking in the tension, the unease, the way some people refused to meet his eyes. Then he smiled. "We'll see." And with that, he walked out, leaving Tate standing behind his counter, drowning in the weight of his own downfall. By the next morning, Tate's bakery was no longer just a bakery. It was a battleground. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Some were holding signs. Others were shouting. The line between protest and spectacle had blurred, and news vans were parked along the curb, cameras rolling, waiting for the next moment to go viral. The town had split in two. On one side, people stood in front of the bakery, signs raised, faces tight with anger. "Accountability matters. Do better, Tate. No room for racism here." They weren't just strangers who had seen the video online. Some of them were longtime customers, neighbors, people who had known Tate for years but had finally seen him for who he was. And then, on the other side, his defenders. They weren't as loud, but they were there, arms crossed, shaking their heads, rolling their eyes at the chants. "This is ridiculous." Cancel culture at it again. He didn't even do anything wrong. And at the center of it all, standing inside his shop, was Jonathan Tate. He watched through the bakery's large front window, his face set in stone, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years building this place. He had loyal customers, a strong reputation. Now, it was unraveling. And yet, he still refused to back down. His staff had stopped asking what to do. The cashier who had started all of this had called in sick. The others moved stiffly, working the register, preparing orders, but the usual flow of the morning was gone. The bakery felt hostile, tense, wrong. A local reporter stepped up to the glass, camera rolling, her voice just loud enough to be heard inside. "Jonathan, do you have anything to say about the video? About Shaquille O'Neal's visit?" Tate exhaled sharply. He was tired of this, tired of the questions, tired of people acting like they had the right to judge him. Finally, he pushed through the doors, stepping outside, into the chaos. The crowd immediately reacted. Some booed, others raised their phones, recording. The reporters moved closer. Tate lifted his hands, pretending to be calm. "Listen," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "I've had enough of this. The internet is overreacting. People get bad service all the time. It wasn't about race. This whole thing has been blown way out of proportion." Shouts rang out from the protesters. "Then why couldn't you answer Shaq's question? If it wasn't about race, why didn't you treat her the same?" Tate ignored them. He focused on the cameras, the audience that actually mattered. "I'm not apologizing for something I didn't do," he said firmly. "This is my business. I have the right to serve who I want, how I want. If people don't like it, they can go somewhere else." More yelling, more protests. But Tate stood firm, convinced he was winning. And then, a voice cut through the noise. Not from the crowd, not from the reporters, from inside the bakery. "You always were too damn stubborn for your own good." The air shifted. People turned. Even Tate froze. Standing just outside the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable, was Donna. His longest-standing employee. His right hand in the business for over a decade. The woman who had practically helped build this bakery alongside him. She never spoke against him, never questioned him publicly. Until now. The crowd fell silent, waiting. Tate frowned. "Donna, what the hell are you doing?" She stepped forward slowly, her expression unreadable. "I've been working here for 15 years, she said. "I've seen a lot." Tate's stomach dropped. He knew exactly where this was going. "Don't do this," he muttered, voice low. "Not here. Not now." But she didn't stop. "I saw how you treated Lucille O'Neal. That wasn't new." Her voice carried a sharpness that cut through the crowd. "That's just how you've always been." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The reporters leaned in. Tate felt the ground shifting beneath him. "Donna," he said through gritted teeth, "this is not your business." She let out a dry laugh. "You're right, it's not. That's why I'm done." Silence. A sharp, painful kind of silence. Tate's stomach twisted. Donna shook her head, stepping back, finally letting go of years of loyalty that he had never deserved. "I quit." Gasps. Even Shaq, watching from a distance, tilted his head slightly. Tate stared at her, eyes burning. "You don't mean that." But she did. She unhooked her apron, let it drop to the ground, and turned away without another word. Tate stood there, speechless. The bakery suddenly felt smaller. His own people were turning against him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Doubt. He had told himself he was right, that this was just another controversy, another internet tantrum that would fade. But Donna had been with him since the beginning. And now, she was done. The cameras were still rolling. The crowd was still there. The bakery was still open. But Jonathan Tate had never felt smaller. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a horrifying thought crept in. Maybe, just maybe, he really was the villain in this story. Jonathan Tate sat in the dimly lit office at the back of his bakery, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk. The noise outside, the protests, the reporters, the endless murmurs of betrayal, felt like a dull roar pressing against the walls. He had spent the last 24 hours drowning in it. He never imagined things would spiral like this. Losing customers was one thing. Losing Donna, that was something else entirely. He had built this place from the ground up. Every brick, every menu item, every carefully crafted reputation, it had been his control, his rules, his success. Now all of it was slipping through his fingers. The door creaked open, and Tate barely had the energy to look up. Shaquille O'Neal stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The air shifted. For the first time since this mess started, it was just the two of them. No cameras, no crowd, no audience. Tate scoffed, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. "You here to gloat?" Shaq didn't sit. He didn't need to. He simply placed his massive hands on the back of the chair across from Tate's desk, leaning slightly, his gaze sharp. "You think losing your business is the worst thing?" His voice was calm, measured. "Number. The worst thing is looking back one day and realizing you were the villain in your own story." Tate let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Oh, that's rich." Shaq didn't react. He simply studied him, waiting. Tate exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "You want an apology? That it?" "No." That answer caught him off guard. Tate frowned. "Then what do you want?" Shaq pulled the chair back, finally sitting. He laced his fingers together, resting his elbows on his knees. "I want change." Tate let out another scoff, but Shaq didn't let him interrupt. "I could let this place go under," Shaq continued. "I could let you dig your own grave, watch you lose everything." He leaned in slightly. "But I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in making things right." Tate shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like the way Shaq was looking at him, like he wasn't the enemy, but a man who had a choice to make. "So what?" Tate muttered. "You want me to write a check to some charity? Take a sensitivity class?" Shaq smiled, not amused, but knowing. "I want to make you an offer." Tate raised an eyebrow. "An offer?" Shaq nodded. "I'll back your business. I'll keep it running." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Tate blinked. He expected a lecture. He expected Shaq to sit there and revel in his downfall. "But this? You want to help me?" Tate's voice was thick with disbelief. Shaq leaned back in his chair. "Not help you, help the business. But there are conditions." Tate narrowed his eyes. "I knew there was a catch." Shaq lifted a hand, counting off his fingers. 1. You overhaul your hiring policies. Open your doors to people who reflect the real world. 2. You and every employee go through diversity training. Real training, not just some 2-hour video. And 3. You start partnering with Black-owned suppliers. You make this place a real part of the community. Tate barked out a laugh. "You can't be serious." Shaq didn't blink. Dead serious. Tate shook his head. "You expect me to just hand over my business to your agenda?" Shaq's expression didn't change. "I expect you to save it." Tate swallowed hard, looking away. The words had weight. He knew what was coming if he refused. Shaq sat back, watching him carefully. "Your bakery won't survive this on its own. People have seen who you are. You can either fight against that and lose everything, or you can prove that you're willing to be better." Tate stared at the floor, his jaw tightening. It felt like a trap. But deep down, he knew Shaq was right. He was losing. He had already lost control of the narrative. And if he didn't do something fast, he'd lose everything else too. For the first time since this entire mess started, Tate felt something foreign creeping in. The terrifying possibility that maybe he had been wrong. He swallowed, still refusing to meet Shaq's eyes. "You're serious about this?" Shaq nodded. 100%. Tate ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath. This was it, the moment of choice. His pride screamed at him to say no. But his instincts, the part of him that understood survival, told him he didn't have much of a choice. Finally, he looked up, searching Shaq's face for any sign of a trick, a setup, something. He found nothing but certainty. Tate exhaled sharply. If I agree, what happens next? Shaq stood up. Then you start proving to everyone that you deserve this second chance. Tate looked at his hands, flexing his fingers as if trying to feel the weight of the moment. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. He had no idea if he could do this, if he could change. But he knew one thing for sure. If he didn't try, he had already lost. And maybe, just maybe, this was the only way to win. Jonathan Tate sat alone in his bakery, the silence pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. The once bustling shop, the place he had built from scratch, was now a hollow shell of itself. The tables sat empty, the glass display cases still stocked with pastries that no one had bought. The smell of fresh bread lingered, but instead of warmth, it carried the stale scent of failure. Outside, the lights of a news van flickered against the darkened windows. The reporters were still out there, waiting, watching, ready for his next mistake. The last few days had been a nightmare. Boycotts, bad press, walkouts. His most loyal customers had vanished. The regulars who had once filled this place with morning chatter now crossed the street instead of stepping inside. He had checked the bakery's financials earlier. The numbers made his stomach churn. If this continued, he had maybe 2 months, 3 at best, before everything collapsed. And yet, his pride still fought against the truth. He could still hear Shaq's words, sharp and unshakable. You think losing your business is the worst thing? Number. The worst thing is looking back one day and realizing you were the villain in your own story. Tate exhaled slowly, rubbing his face with both hands. Villain. He wasn't a villain. He had never thought of himself that way. He was a businessman, a hard worker, a self-made man. And yet, Donna had left. His own employees didn't trust him. His own town had turned against him. And for the first time, he had no one left to blame but himself. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that this wasn't his fault, that Shaq had blown everything out of proportion, that the internet had twisted the truth, that people were just looking for something to be mad about. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't just about one bad interaction. It was about who he had been for years and how blind he had been to it. And now he was paying the price. The worst part? Shaq had given him a way out, a way to fix this, a way to survive. But taking it, accepting Shaq's offer, would mean admitting he had been wrong. His ego screamed against it. He had spent years being the man in charge, making the rules, deciding how things worked. And now, he was being told to change, to open his doors to new employees, to partner with Black-owned businesses, to go through diversity training like some clueless corporate manager who didn't know how to treat people. It felt like an insult, like an attack on everything he had built. And yet, it was the only way forward. His survival depended on it. Tate let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his whole life believing that hard work, grit, and self-reliance were all that mattered. Now, the only thing that could save him was the man he had dismissed as an outsider. The man who had walked into his shop and exposed everything Tate had tried to ignore. Shaq had been right about one thing. This wasn't just about race. It was about power. Tate had built this bakery believing he was in control, that he got to decide who mattered. And now, that illusion was shattered. For the first time in years, Jonathan Tate wasn't the one holding the cards. And he hated it. But more than that, he feared it. Because if he accepted Shaq's deal, if he changed his business, changed himself, who would he be after that? He had spent his whole life believing he was a good man, a fair man, a hard-working American who had done everything right. But what if, all this time, he had been the problem? The thought made his chest tight. His hands clenched into fists on the desk. He didn't want to accept it, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. Tate closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. For the first time since this all started, he allowed himself to sit with the truth. No excuses, no anger, no defense, just the raw, ugly truth of who he had been and who he could still become. Outside, The reporters were still waiting. Inside, Tate sat alone, finally facing himself. And by the time he opened his eyes again, he knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, everything would change, whether he was ready for it or not. The smell of fresh bread drifted out onto the street, curling through the crisp morning air. The sign above the door still read, Tate's Bakery, but everything else felt different. Inside, the place breathed new life. The once too familiar, too selective atmosphere had changed. The walls had been repainted in warm, welcoming tones. The layout had been slightly adjusted, the space feeling more open, more inviting. But it wasn't the decor that made the biggest difference. It was the people. A mixed crowd filled the bakery now. Black, white, young, old, families, students, business professionals. Conversations flowed easily. Laughter mingled with the clinking of coffee cups. The once unspoken rules of who belonged and who didn't had been erased. For the first time in years, Tate's Bakery truly felt like it belonged to everyone. At the back of the shop, Jonathan Tate stood in silence, watching. He wasn't behind the counter anymore. He wasn't at the register, or calling out orders, or shaking hands with longtime customers. Instead, he stood by the doorway to his office, arms folded, observing a world he had almost lost. The bakery had survived, but he knew. He was no longer the same man who had once run it. The changes hadn't come easily. The hiring policies had been rewritten from the ground up. His staff now included a diverse mix of backgrounds, something that had once seemed so insignificant. But now, as he watched them work seamlessly together, he wondered how he had ever believed otherwise. Diversity training had been met with resistance at first, especially from him. He had hated sitting through those meetings, being forced to confront things he had spent a lifetime ignoring. But he had listened. And despite his instincts to push back, to fight, to argue, he had learned. Partnering with Black-owned suppliers had been another battle. At first, it had felt like a forced move, a business deal made out of necessity rather than belief. But then he had met them. He had seen the same hunger, the same fight, the same pride in their work that he had always had in his own. And it had humbled him. This wasn't charity. This was what business should have been all along. Now, standing at the back of his own bakery, he no longer felt like the king of his castle. And maybe that was a good thing. The bell above the door jingled, and Tate's chest tightened slightly. Lucille O'Neal had just walked in. She hesitated for only a second before stepping fully inside, her presence as composed and graceful as ever. She took in the bakery, the new faces, the new energy, the undeniable shift in the air. A staff member at the counter, a young Black woman, smiled warmly. Not out of obligation, not out of forced politeness. A real smile. "Good morning. Welcome to Tate's Bakery. What can I get for you?" Lucille let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And then, slowly, she smiled back. Tate exhaled from his place in the shadows, his shoulders easing in a way they hadn't in months. This was it. This was what he had fought so hard against, and what he had needed all along. At that moment, Shaq stepped through the door. Tate felt him before he saw him. The familiar presence, larger than life, yet somehow never overbearing. Tate turned, eyes meeting Shaq's from across the room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Shaq didn't offer a smirk, didn't say, "I told you so." And Tate didn't offer an apology, not because he wasn't sorry, but because Shaq already knew. They both did. Instead, Shaq simply gave a small nod. Tate returned it. Simple. Enough. At the far end of the shop, hanging just above the counter, was a framed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Second chances taste sweeter." Tate had never believed in second chances. Now, he was living in one. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to waste it. Some stories aren't just stories, they're mirrors. How many moments like this go unseen? How many people walk away unheard? Change doesn't start with the ones who get caught. It starts with the ones who choose to see. The next time silence feels easier, ask yourself, what would you have done?